Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us at the November MCAP webinar. We will be starting in just a couple minutes, but in the meantime, just hang tight and we'll let a few more folks come into the room, and we'll start at about 12:02. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I think we'll go ahead and get started here. Thank you for joining us for the November edition of the Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership webinar series. The partnership is hosted by the Water Resources Center at the University of Minnesota. My name is Joel Larson. I'm the Associate Director there, and I'm very happy to be hosting Eric Wojchik, who's here from the Met Council. He's going to be presenting a talk called Keeping an Open Mind, Multidisciplinary Adaptation Practice is Vital. And just a couple of logistical notes before we begin and I introduce Eric. The webinar will end promptly at 1. All of the participants are muted, so you will have a chance to ask questions at the end of the webinar using the Q&A function. Once we open that up, I'll provide some instructions on how to ask those questions. We do want to make sure that we're also providing relevant and useful information to you all, so please take a few minutes at the end of the webinar to fill out a brief evaluation that should pop up after it ends. And then just so folks know, we are recording the webinar. We are hoping to post this one and the others that we've had in the series at a later date. So with that, I'd like to introduce Eric, who's joining us here this afternoon. Eric is a planning analyst at the Met Council, where he provides planning and technical assistance to metro communities to achieve local and regional goals, especially focused on sustainability and planning for resilience. He performs resilience and sustainability project work at the Council to implement the policies of Thrive MSP 2040. Prior to working at the Council, Eric performed environmental planning work in the Hebrides Islands in Scotland for almost a decade, where sustainability and resilience planning was embedded into practices because of the need for self-sufficiency and efficient use of local resources. Eric brings much of this thinking to his Minnesota work. Eric, thanks for joining us, and I'll let you take it away.
Thanks so much, Joel. I appreciate that. Let me just see if I can share the screen. It looks like you're all looking at that, I'm guessing, right?
Looks great.
Great, thank you. First of all, thank you so much for this opportunity to present today. This is a topic near and dear to my heart, and I'll explain why. But I always start out my presentations because I also teach at St. Thomas and the University of Minnesota, and the students know me for usually putting a really irreverent, bad comedy meme at the beginning of every presentation. So this one's a little bit more gentle, but I thought I'd throw up a little meme there for you to look at. Like Joel said, I do work at the Metropolitan Council. Just so you all know, there will be a section in this presentation on the Council's work on adaptation planning. We have been doing for many years now, well, certainly since 2014, we've been working on mitigation, adaptation, and resilience planning at the regional level here in Minnesota. But this focus is going to be a lot broader than that. I will touch on the Met Council work, and I would encourage you to reach out to me if you have not engaged with our Met Council tools yet, because I certainly want them to have a wider audience. So we'll touch on that. But I do feel like we all, with everything going on with the pandemic, I feel like we all need a little bit of voyeurism and escapism right now. So we're going to have a presentation that's a little bit more philosophical in nature. So bear with me, but I think hopefully you'll like it. It's kind of hard to follow last month's presentation by Dr. Potter, which was absolutely excellent, but I'll do my best. I think Joel will be monitoring the Q&A as well, and we can certainly return to that after the presentation. So we're going to start off really with the importance of framing. And, you know, I teach, like I said, at university, and I often tell my students, talk to them about the importance of framing and how vital that is to the environmental work that we do, especially in environmental policy. One thing I usually start the students off with is this 10 versions of the same scene, which was written up in the 1970s. And it's by this gentleman named Menig. And you can see the quote at the top there: landscape is composed not only what lies before our eyes, but what lies within our heads. So I want the students to understand early on that they come to any conversation about policy, they come with their value system. You know, they're coming with their, you know, inbuilt value system to that conversation, which would inform the work that they're doing. It's important to recognize that, because we need to know what undergirds our values and why those values are there. Quite often, that comes from how you were raised or how you've engaged with the environment growing up. But it's also important to recognize when you are employing those biases that may inform your work, and when to put those aside. For instance, if you have to make a difficult decision. I don't know if any of you've ever looked at this document, but I would encourage you to have a look at it. The interesting thing about it is that the students, I have them choose a scene that they most connect with, a landscape view that they connect with, and invariably they find 2 or 3. And then the question I ask is, you know, would the scene that you choose, you know, your view of a landscape change based on your experience with that type of landscape? And they say, oh yeah. So, you know, I want them to understand that, you know, location matters and your experience matters, and that can change from day to day even. It can change based on your mood. So one thing I really want you to walk away with is this idea that adaptation, we all do adaptation work. I saw on the participation list a lot of water people, which is great. I try to be an honorary water person when I can. But adaptation is not just a practice that we employ on the ground. It's also a mindset towards personal and professional process change. So I think we really need to kind of open up our minds to the idea that adaptation is about behavioral change, but it's also about how we make our organizations more nimble in light of climate change, because our organizations haven't been, they were created in a pre-climate change environment, and the mechanisms for how they work, they tend to assume a baseline that never changes. So we need to really think about adaptation at the personal scale, but also at the organizational scale. And one thing I talk about with my students is this idea of framing that, you know, going to a meeting with a bunch of graphs and trying to change people's minds on a particular project, or to bring them around to understanding a climate change issue, it doesn't tend to work, because we're human, so we respond most effectively to stories that connect with our value system. And you can get people to change their views if you can work within their frames, you know, that undergirding of values, work within their frames to bring them around to an idea. A good example is when we talk about the environment in a rural setting, we might talk about natural resource conservation. We might talk about the impact of climate change on recreational amenities like snowmobiling, things like that. But I try to instill this idea in students that, we need to bring around people around to the conversation through connecting with them in a real, meaningful, intentional way. And I think of all the agencies within the state of Minnesota, one agency that's doing this very effectively is the Minnesota Department of Health with its climate program, focusing on stories of Minnesotans and how they're experiencing climate change. And I think that that is going to be the most effective way to connect going forward. I can't talk about connection without, the bringing into the mainstream of ecology through Rachel Carson, really breathing life into the environment and bringing science to life through storytelling and through her passion for the environment. I think it's important to return to her because her book made such a huge impact at the time in 1962 when there were so many environmental issues. And to me, it's really heartening to see a lot of climate scientists actually adopting this model a lot more in the last 5 years through blogging and through outreach, essentially telling the story of what's happening as opposed to just focusing on the data. The data is important. It supports the stories, but the stories are also very vital for communication. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Scotland. And for those of you who were expecting me to talk a lot about Met Council, you might be a little bit disappointed, but I will talk about that. But I think we could all do with some nice photos of faraway places right now because we're not going to be able to travel for a while. So I thought this might be nice for some people to kind of imagine other places. I did work in Scotland for almost a decade. I worked a lot on environmental planning. And that was because we had a small group of people and I was the only one willing to do that work. So I was very interested in it and I cared deeply about it. And it had a profound impact on how I view adaptation and the adaptation work I do here in Minnesota, I believe. So I was located out in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland, an island chain consisting of about 24,000 people. I lived in the main town there, which was about 8,000 people. So very, very sparsely populated, very rural, very agrarian, very resource-based economy, fishing, some of the best fishing in the world, in fact. But there's also a lot of offshore work that is done. A lot of the people that live on the island actually work in the oil industry, but they work offshore for much of the year. And this is the kind of environment that I was stepping into. So being from Minnesota, it's very different. What you do to the landscape here is very visible. As you can see, there's not a tree in this photo, right? In fact, the school children would quite often take field trips to the mainland to go look at trees because trees were so sparse on the island. And as a planner, working as a planner there, any development that was going up was going to have an impact, certainly a visual impact on the landscape. So we had to be very cognizant of the work we were doing and be very sensitive to that landscape, which could be a challenge as a planner. Early on in my career as a planner there, I was taken out by the equivalent of the Department of Natural Resources in Scotland. It's called the Scottish Natural Heritage. And they took me out to do a survey of these pearl mussels, which are freshwater stream pearl mussels. They are an endangered species because people poach them for the pearls and then sell them. And we actually had to be blindfolded and taken to this site. And we were doing a survey and they were trying to teach us the importance of this really, really valuable almost, I think it's like one of the longest living invertebrates that we know, and they can live to be over 100 years old. And when I started to understand the life cycle of this creature, and that they essentially attach themselves to a juvenile salmon, and then they live in the salmon's gill for a year before detaching and then attaching in the substrata of a freshwater stream to grow into one of these mussels. And even then, the chance of survival is very small. So the fact that these are living creatures and that they can survive for over 100 years was kind of amazing to me. And I remember taking one out of the stream and holding it up to my hand and thinking, wow, this is older than me, because we could actually measure them and work out the age. But this had a profound effect on me because I'm a land use planner. So understanding the sensitivity of these creatures to the difference in water pH from any sort of upstream development that might be occurring. I hadn't, honestly, as a planner, and I can hold up my hand and say this, that we quite often are not connected, as connected as we should be to that kind of water and land use nexus that is so important. And I know that the watershed people on this call will understand that I'm very interested in water quality, but I'm also interested in bringing their expertise into the planning profession because we need it. But this really was eye-opening for me, and it kind of took me on a journey of thinking about planning in a much different way, in a much more integrated, holistic way. There's also in Scotland in this part of Scotland, a very deep, rich material culture that is different than other parts of the British Isles. They cut turf or peat for fuel, which is a non-renewable resource, but for all intents and purposes, it's very low impact because it's done on such a small scale, and it's very locally based. So this turf that's cut is usually, about a mile from a house by tractor. You would cut it and dry it and then burn it in your house. So in terms of like carbon emissions, it's pretty low actually when you compare it to things like oil. But the people of the island were very proud of their material culture. They also have their own language out there, which they are very proud of. Going to council meetings was like going to the United Nations because I had to wear a headset, and someone was always translating in real time the Gaelic to English. So that was an interesting experience. But being a planner there, we had to think about siting of houses and design of houses very carefully because, like I said, the trees are not on this landscape. So it's not like things are going to be covered in trees or covered in vegetation where you wouldn't have to look at them. So trying to encourage local people and also developers to design with sensitivity to the environment, really taking cues from either traditional architecture that existed there or also nature. So low profile natural materials was really key in terms of making things fit with the landscape. And this really, like I said, this really informed my view of adaptation because adaptation is much wider than what we think of it as. It's also working with the landscape, making a low impact, but that's visually as well as, water quality or habitat or biodiversity. Here's an example of a community center, larch cladding, a low profile, kind of a natural wave to it. This is looking from above, but from the road looking up, it kind of just recedes into the background of the hill, which was kind of the intention here with this design. And then you have designs also that are almost like biomimicry, where they're taking huge cues from the archaeological past. In this case, an Iron Age fort, which is called a broch, on the left, and on the right you have a very modern bed and breakfast or self-catering cottage, which is referencing that broch. So sits very nicely within the landscape, referencing the past. I actually was able to stay in this after it was just constructed because they wanted someone to test it out. So I was kind of lucky to do that. Right now, I think it's like $1,500 or $1,600 for like a week. So I couldn't afford it now, but back then it was fine. So a big part of working out there obviously was that it was really expensive to get logistics. Anything had to be brought to the island by boat. It's a 3-hour journey by boat. Very expensive to bring materials. So if you could use materials locally, also if you could generate your own electricity, usually through a small scale wind turbines or through micro hydro schemes, that was something that people were doing, not necessarily because of the environment, but also because it made financial sense when they penciled it out to try to work with what was on the island as opposed to bringing things onto the island. And also generating your own, generating your own energy, that sort of thing. Here's a development I worked on pretty extensively over a couple of years, which was an infill site, which was really just sitting there vacant for many, many years, right in the heart of a town, the town of Tarbert in the Isle of Harris. And a distillery was built here. Again, the design taking a lot of cues from traditional architecture, a very strong roof pitch, fits in well with everything around it. And another, one of the issues with this site was that it was abstracting water from up on the hill because they were making whiskey and making gin. So that water abstraction and the permit required had to be very carefully vetted by the equivalent of the PCA. And then we also had to be very sensitive about what was discharged then into the sea from this location, making sure that it wasn't causing pollution. But one thing that really kind of had a huge impact on me being in Scotland was the idea of the commons. So we often study the commons, and when we teach our students about the commons, but quite often we talk about it as if it's this thing in the past. The Enclosure Acts that took place in Britain, basically getting rid of the commons. Well, there are parts of the world where there is still commons, and this island chain is one of those parts of the world where the law still governs that commons land. And here, this photo kind of shows you the strips of land. We have good and bad soil. Everybody has a share of the good and bad. But also when people develop on the commons, if a wind farm comes along and develops on that commons, everybody in the village gets a share of the benefit. So that money flows back to the community, and that money is put to really good use in community centers, elder care, that sort of thing. Also putting in new nature-based solutions. They actually can fund a lot of these projects through renewables. So I guess what I want to instill in you is the idea of we want to move from doing no harm to do better. So the do no harm we often think of as sustainability, right? I think the idea of sustainability is outdated because I don't think that climate change, when sustainability was first posited in 1987, the idea of climate change wasn't really very widely known at that time. So doing no harm, I think we need to do better than that. We need to talk about regenerating and restoring our natural spaces as opposed to doing no harm. Now, on this scale, you can see that we're still not being sustainable. We're still in a more extractive, degenerative economy. But I do think that the nice thing about doing better is that it's not just about not making an impact. It's about looking at how can we improve the way we're doing things. And that should touch everything. It should touch processes and frameworks going forward. When we talk about do no harm, a lot of people might think about the precautionary principle, which is employed more in Europe than it is here, which essentially posits that if we don't know enough information about the impacts of a project, if it's not clear, then we shouldn't proceed because of that irreversibility issue of doing harm that we don't really understand. So that idea of forward carrying the precautionary principle is important, but I do think we can move beyond that to doing better. And when I think of doing better, I think about this sort of analogy of a ship. When we think of sustainability, the way we talk about sustainability is we might have water coming into the ship, it's damaged, but then we just put up some barriers and we say, well, that's okay. There's no more water coming in, but what we really want to do is think about things in a more regenerative way. We want to take positive actions to mend the ship, leaving it better off than the way we found it. So when we have the degradation of the environment and the quality of environment going down, the idea shouldn't be to leave it as it is or as good as it is for future generations. The idea should be to leave it a lot better. We need to try to restore and regenerate the environment. And this creates the idea of systems change and thinking about things differently, shifting things individually, but also in the private sector and the governmental sector. So now I'm going to just touch on some of the Met Council work, and then I'll come back and kind of wrap this up. I want to talk about the Met Council work because it's important and some of you might not be aware of it. Those of you who don't know much about the Met Council, we consist of the 7-county metro, just over half the state's population. We have 3 major rivers that come together in this area, and a lot of competing jurisdictions and different types of jurisdictions. So we have our principal cities, but then we also have very rural areas as well that we have to work with, and we want to collaborate with to make sure that they're doing planning that works for them and also works for the region. We have our regional systems here as a metropolitan planning organization. So we have our transit system, our regional park system, and our wastewater system. We're a little bit unique as an MPO because we do have these systems, but we also do planning around water supply, water resources. We also do housing policy work. So we have an operational component as well as a planning component. And that's important because through our operations, we can set a lot of good examples if we do it right, but we can also collaborate with partners. So like I said, we have been doing climate change planning for a number of years now. And these definitions will be nothing new to any of you. They're pretty standard definitions. But what I want to touch on is some of the work we've done around adaptation and kind of where we're going with things. The main adaptation resource and analysis we currently have is the Regional Climate Vulnerability Assessment, and that looks at localized flooding and extreme heat. Some of you on this call have already seen this data or should be hopefully aware of it, but if you aren't, I would encourage you to check out the tools, the interactive tools. We also have story maps for a more lay audience that define the issues, but also provide the solutions or suggest some of the solutions. So I'd encourage you to check that out if you haven't. There's a lot of analysis that comes on the back end of this, where we analyze our different systems here, water supply, wastewater, parks, housing. We look at those in relation to like the climate hazard of localized flooding, for instance, and we do actual calculations based on that, identify areas of concern and make recommendations. We are embarking on a climate action plan that's going to operationalize a lot of the recommendations we have within our climate vulnerability assessment, which they tend to be more adaptation related recommendations. Resilience, the way I view resilience is really kind of like an adaptation. It's more about connecting and making important partnerships. Part of the reason that I teach, because I actually find it kind of stressful to teach on the side, but I think it's so critical to work with young people on applied projects, because our young people at college level, at high school level, are going to be the ones trying to work on some of these solutions going forward. So I kind of feel like it's incumbent upon me to do that work with young people and connect them with professionals to see how they might inform that work, but also how they can learn from professionals. I want them to be well equipped, not theoretically equipped, but actually practically equipped when they come out of college. We've done a lot of great partnerships. I saw that Claire is on this call. And I know that we've worked with the watersheds really closely in recent years on different climate projects, which I think is really exciting. This is one series of workshops we held, doing really kind of on the ground level planning. And the idea behind these workshops was to identify climate risks and hazards, and then try to make sure that the communities incorporated those within their long range plans or comprehensive plans. Because when communities can incorporate those in their plans, then we know that those policies filter down to the ground level, to the official control level, and that's really important. For me, it's kind of scary sometimes to make these connections and partnerships and kind of keep open to them, but these projects come out of conversations quite often and being invited to the table. So I think it's important to think about our jobs as much wider than we might normally think of when we're doing this work. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Global Climate System Commons. And I think we need to start referring to it as that, because we are part of a whole and it really does matter. Everything we do in Minnesota will either create benefits or disbenefits to other parts of the world. So we need to really start thinking about, obviously the mitigation side is important. But the adaptation work we do is really critical as well. And that's why when I went to the climate conference last year with a group of with a Minnesota delegation, I walked away really impacted by what I was hearing from other parts of the world, from different delegates that were attending that event. We had a Minnesota delegation climate action, the U.S. Climate Action Center, and again, showing that Minnesota is working together on these issues. But it was interesting after this presentation that we heard from the audience. They came up to us and they were just, they were saying, it was so exciting to hear from a mid-continent state that's doing climate work, because we quite often hear only from the coasts. And, I had island nations coming up to me and saying, thank you, Minnesota, for the work that you're doing, because it matters to us, because we're on the front lines. We're seeing climate change right now. And I think that was one of the issues that I really came to grips with at the conference was we often talk about climate change as this distant thing in Minnesota. Those of us who work in it know that's not the case, but I think the lay public kind of talks about it as if it's going to come at some point, but it is here. But when you talk to these other parts of the world, especially island nations and people from the global south, you realize that villages are being displaced, sea level is rising, whole islands are being inundated. There's major storm impacts occurring now. So it's not like this is some distant, far off thing for a lot of these countries. And we need to start thinking about this in a more integrated way. So going back to that main point, how can we do better as opposed to just doing no harm? I really like this quote here from Bill Reed. I think he was one of the founding board members of the U.S. Green Building Council, but he talks about it. Instead of doing less damage to the environment, it is necessary to learn how we can participate with the environment, using the health of ecological systems as a basis for design. The shift from a fragmented worldview to a whole systems mental model is the significant leap our culture must make, framing and understanding living system interrelationships in an integrated way. A place-based approach is one way to achieve this understanding. Our role as designers and stakeholders is to shift our relationship to one that creates a whole system of mutually beneficial relationships. So when we think about ecosystems and ecology, we think about it in terms of relationships, right? So I think one of the challenges I have is that we don't think of our work that way quite often. And I think we need to start thinking of our work as an ecosystem, because we need to think about how to actually deal with the issue of climate change and adaptation through essentially embedding these practices into our work. So do we all have to be futurists, behaviorists, and polymaths? Well, a little bit. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm not asking everyone to be Buckminster Fuller and design geodesic domes and whatnot, but we have to be looking to the future, but we also have to recognize the fact that behaviors will need to change, not just personal behaviors, but also those organizational behaviors. And it's not, and we shouldn't be afraid of calling ourselves polymaths. Or a polymath is essentially somebody who is learned in a lot of different areas. I don't pretend to be more than I am, but it's important that I engage with the other disciplines because I can't do the work unless I'm working with water scientists, unless I'm working with transit planners. The work's not effective unless I try to get some of that expertise under my belt through working with them. So we can't be afraid to not know the answers. We need to ask the questions and work with others. So this is kind of this is kind of coming up towards the end of the presentation, but so multi-jurisdictional collaborations, like how do we do this? I think we need to start considering adaptation work as personal and dynamic, so it's changing. And that means that behavioral change is a form of adaptation. Part of climate change is process change. We need to start thinking of it this way. We need to know that some of the mechanisms within our organizations are they're not prepared for climate change. And we need to be able to change our organizations in quick ways to do the work. Regenerative sustainability, or the do better principle, requires us to consider systems change in our work. And given the complexity of this, we need to seek help outside of our traditional professional lanes. And those of you who know me know that I'm not afraid of working with others. And I think we just need to be doing more of that. And climate change will not wait for us. So we need to recognize we have a responsibility to act, even if we're feeling discomfort and a lack of knowledge. I'll never forget the first time I went to the climatologist's office to ask them for help on my project. I felt really, really just overwhelmed and not prepared, and I didn't feel like I had the expertise. But they gave me chocolate, they talked me through it, and they said, you know, you doing something at the Met Council is much better than us doing nothing. So whatever product or tool you create might not be the best one, but it's a step in the right direction, because that inertia of inaction, waiting for the perfect piece of data, can be paralyzing. And we have to move away from that. And we need to establish collaborative frameworks. We have a lot of those in place, but we need to continue that journey. It's important to recognize frontline communities, because we need to be intentional and we need to think about balance in our approach. And that means understanding that policy implications are different across different populations. So when we are enacting different policies, they may have benefits or disbenefits to different groups of people. We need to build that into the work we're doing. We need to acknowledge that there is systematic injustice, and that goes back, many, many years. We need to, in a lot of instances, try to let impacted communities lead if we can on certain projects. We need to not be afraid to use racial and economic analysis to drive our decisions. We need to target strategies that benefit all of us and create net environmental and economic benefits for communities of color and people with lower incomes. I've been really heartened actually in the last few years, especially working with watershed districts, that they have really taken on thinking about equity in their work, and just really, not just thinking about daylighting a project or making sure that there's a lot of, great information that can be learned from a project, but actually thinking about, we have a water quality issue here. It may not be an area where people are really going to see the impacts, but it's still important in terms of the people that live in this location. So I've been really heartened by that. And this is not an exhaustive list, but this is kind of, my list of what multidisciplinary collaborations look like. We have a lot of these in Minnesota. I'm really heartened by this. I'll never forget when I was working with the city of Minneapolis on a project trying to get some other communities in the nation. There was a community in Michigan that was trying to do some adaptation and vulnerability assessment work. And the city hadn't even thought of talking to the university. And the university had an environmental studies program and geography program, and they were looking for applied projects. So I do think we're really pretty well set up in Minnesota, but I do think that there's things to do where we can better really embed those practices of working across the different sectors. We've got a lot of great examples here of really great work, but I think we can do more. One thing I've noticed that's been really great is cities working a lot more with universities on small scale projects and getting those over the finish line, because cities a lot of times don't have capacity or the funds to do some of that work. And I put another lamb photo in there for you. There's a little reference to Scotland. So the opportunities today, I think, are holistic connected thinking. And I think we need to move away from just talking about the technical side of things and the expertise, but actually being determined and using our wisdom and courage. And I'm only saying that because I think that a lot of us have imposter syndrome and we can feel like we don't know where to start. But I think that can be an actionable feeling. I think we can actually translate that into action. And then we go and we talk to the right people to get the job done. Bringing your whole self to the conversation is important. We can't be afraid to be humans, because we're all going to be affected by climate change. So we we shouldn't be afraid of bringing our whole self to that conversation with all of our value system, all of our frames that inform that. We can still work within the public interest by being ourselves and being real, being authentic. That's possible. And then thinking about projects outside our mental and professional boundaries. And I'm not putting watershed districts and planners up here because I think they don't work well together. But my whole point is, I think that there needs to be a little bit more blurring of that, where we are working much more hand in hand on projects. And I know that's easier said than done. Great. I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Eric, thank you so much for that presentation. That was really great. And I love the idea of frames and of regenerative work as well for adaptation. Just one housekeeping question that I can answer is, we will be working to put these presentations online. In the interim, I can talk with Eric, or Eric and I can talk about sharing the presentation or a portion of it with people who attended today. So we will have a chance to share those in more detail. So Eric, one question is, how do we convince those who aren't exactly deniers but are not exactly on board the importance of multidisciplinary collaboration?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know how to put this, but I'm gonna say the best thing you can do is find your find your kind of your secret team that you work with and talk and bounce ideas off of. I've got a group that I work with at the council where if we want to do something organizationally, we want to like push on something, we'll get together and kind of kick it around individually, just over coffee. And a lot of times that is about bringing the right people in at the right time. There is always going to be a certain portion of your organization that is not on board, and they might not ever be on board actually, and that's okay. I think making the right alliances internally can make it so that you can actually move forward with that change. And I think the challenge with us is that all of us know that work in agencies, that change can feel very slow at times, but I think by creating allies within the organization, I think, and creating those fora where you can actually speak openly and throw out crazy ideas and see if they stick, that's really important. It's really healthy for an organization. But yeah, I think there's always going to be people that aren't going to come along with you, but you have to be very strategic about it.
Thank you. Can you say or talk a little bit more about the point that you made that a part of climate change is process change?
Yeah, I think, like I said, this is going to be a little bit more philosophical. But when we think about adaptation, even the word adaptation, it's got constant change rolled up into it, right? So by changing, by thinking of it just in terms of research and development or projects on the ground, I think we're kind of missing a bigger part of what it really is. It's the fact that when I talk to students about things that are observable now that I've seen in my lifetime, like here's an example. So the fact that when we drive on trips now, long road trips, you don't get any bugs on your windscreen, right? I remember being a kid and like your windshield would be covered in bugs, and I tell this to my students, and they don't even know what I'm talking about, because within their lifetime they've lived within a changed climate. So that that kind of lack of baseline understanding of what it used to be like, we're in constant flux. So we need to know that personally, as well as what we're seeing in the world, we're in constant flux with climate change. There kind of is no baseline anymore. So we need to be able to think about, when we think about our regulations and what we're doing on the ground, those might need to actually constantly change, and they might need to respond more to the situation. Like, when we think about nature-based solutions, we might not need to think specifically, not about what the regulation is to treat 1 inch worth of water or whatever. it might need to be more site specific in terms of how we deal with that. I'm trying to think about this a lot broader than, how we've done things in the past. We need to have a more dynamic way of actually doing this work. I don't know if that answers the question, hopefully.
Thanks. Another one that came in is, do you think we're moving fast enough on adaptation work? Do we have the tools and thinking we need to make our actions more concrete? Do we have clarity about what we need to do and the order?
No, we're not. I had a conversation with someone recently. My challenge too is that I still, we need to, like I said, we need to live in our discomfort. I mean, one thing that I realized through a conversation with a fellow professional recently is that there's not a lot of adaptation literacy at the Capitol, at the legislative side. And that's a failing on all of us, because if we want adaptation policy passed in our state, we need to be up on the Capitol and actually, explaining what this is and why it's important a lot more than we are. We can work in our space, but we need to think broader about, bringing that policy, that policy literacy up high and making sure that that people know what we're talking about. I think for far too long we've been more focused on mitigation, and I understand that. But the problem with Minnesota is I think that we often haven't thought about adaptation as much because we haven't felt or known of the acute impacts of climate change until we have, an extreme event like what we saw in Duluth. I think what we're missing here with adaptation is we're fine with the acute shocks and thinking about acute shocks, but we're not thinking about the chronic stress of our infrastructure and systems. And that's because it's slow moving, it's almost indiscernible, but it's happening, So I don't think adaptation has enough prevalence in terms of people's thinking when they think about climate change in Minnesota.
I think I might follow up with a question there related to that, because it is difficult to frame climate change as imperative when, like you're saying, some of the change just by its nature is very slow and that can result in these big events, but we don't necessarily associate the two together. So could you talk a little bit about kind of how you either could see or have seen using framing to take action in this kind of context? So whether it's focusing on an economic or financial frame or focusing on an environmental frame, and maybe even adding to that, connecting that back to what you talked about pretty early on with the emotional level and that emotional connection with folks.
Well, I think one of the most effective frames that I've seen in Minnesota that's been employed is thinking about things through the health lens. And I think that at the Met Council, I've been kind of nervous about going down that avenue because we don't do health, but the challenge is like people understand health and they're comfortable with it. It's usually part of their value system. So I think that's why in a lot of ways that Department of Health has been fairly effective when framing climate change around health impacts and around making sure people have a healthy environment and livability. Those frames are really, they resonate with people. They understand them much more than in a lot of ways other things. And of course, healthy environment can include, healthy habitat. I know that when I've worked with certain communities about urban tree canopy, they may, I know one community was going to just completely scrap their urban tree canopy their fund, for maintenance and everything. But then when we framed it in a healthy living context, and also we monetize some of those ecosystem services, suddenly it was a different, the elected members were much more interested in tree canopy after that. So I think, employing some of those tools that are available to bring value, thinking about trees as infrastructure. I know a lot of you are probably familiar with that because you do a lot of environmental planning, but we need to be better about, I know it's hard to put value on some of these things, but for decision makers, it can make a big difference. And it gives them cover, to allocate funds or resources to different projects.
Thanks. In many ways, this is an exercise in empathy and understanding what really would drive people and what people are feeling about a particular issue. It's a great point. So there's a couple of questions on similar themes, so maybe I'll ask one and we can get to the others. So you mentioned an example of working with the city of Minneapolis and how they hadn't yet reached out to the university for assistance in climate adaptation planning, and how certain watershed districts have found a role in adaptation facilitation with their member cities. Are there other units of local government that you think could assist in connecting with climate change adaptation folks? Who else needs to be connected? And there are a couple other questions in there about Met Council's interaction with county groups or other groups outside the metro, or private citizens, or K-12 education.
Oh, that's a lot.
So you can maybe pick one of those and then we'll go on to the other ones.
Yeah, I mean, I think the counties have done some really interesting work, and some of the counties have been reaching out to us recently too about sharing of resources, which I think is really promising. I know Hennepin County's done, for instance, their tree prioritization analysis, looking at EAB, but they also included things like our heat map and socioeconomic metrics into that analysis, which I thought was really good. But I think that one missing piece here is I do think that we've not been. I think one major missing piece is that we have not really been working with the private sector as much in Minnesota as we probably should be. I do think that it's been interesting in the last few years that I presented to some groups. My dad used to be a paramedic, so I've been presenting to a few emergency services staff across the metro in different locations, showing them some of our tools and how they could apply them in their work. And that's been really interesting because it's an audience that I hadn't really worked with much before, but it's exciting because they're wanting to do things. They work on hazard mitigation, which for all intents and purposes is kind of similar to some of the stuff that we're looking at, but looking at it through climate change hazards. But I think that those partnerships could be maybe more firmed up, but it's heartening to see like our state mitigation plan incorporating climate change, and seeing that done was really heartening. But yeah, I think the K-12. I haven't worked as much with high schools, but I know some planners like one of my former colleagues, Corinne, runs a planning project where she works with high schoolers to teach them about planning. Actually reached out. I mentor a young boy, and I reached out to his geography professor because I wanted to present on climate change. But yeah, I think it's probably a little bit more ad hoc, but we could probably do better in that area.
So I guess building on that a little bit, with all of the potential opportunities, all of us have limited time or limited networks. How do you go about, or how would you kind of think about going about deciding who to reach out to first, how to best use your time in building these connections? What does that look like for either you or for the Met Council or for other groups that you've worked with?
That's a good question. I mean, I think, I tend to try to lean into, I think usually in these situations, the leaders kind of rise to the surface, and it tends to be the subject matter experts for whatever the given item is. I remember we had the Los Angeles people come here to speak about, it was a Cool Cities Alliance, I believe. And the cross section of people in that room was great. From the Minnesota side, we had foresters, we had Department of Health, we had Met Council, we had several cities there, the Science Museum. It was all very, university was there too. So the idea around that was, could we convene such a group here in Minnesota, and what would that look like? And I think, it's pretty quick to see who might be at that table, and then maybe have subgroups coming off of that. But I think there are a lot of collaborations occurring in Minnesota, but I do feel like there needs to be a way that we can kind of, we need the space to be able to do the work. I think that's one of the challenges is like, I honestly like, it needs to be part of our work plan, and for it to be part of our work plan, those frameworks need to be kind of codified, whether that's through the legislature or something, but carving out time to work on things, making a case to your boss every time or whatever, that's not going to cut it. We need things that are more established than that to make sure that the work is getting done, because the space needs to be made, and the staff need to be, there needs to be the hours to do the work. One thing I've been doing a lot of is getting students to work on projects, and anybody could do that. But then the challenge around that is that what you end up with is maybe not quite what you wanted, but you might be able to take 70% of that and use that. But it is definitely worth it for building capacity. And then you also give those students a really great experience in the process of doing real work.
Great, thank you. Can you talk a little bit about how Met Council is communicating to private citizens, or specific examples?
I was kind of hoping that question would be asked because it's really hard to answer. But it's something. I'm glad that question was asked because it's something I really struggle with working at the council. Is that our clients tend to be the cities, and it's always been that way. So it tends to be staff to staff or staff to watershed, or that's the way it's always been. And unless we're doing a big policy plan, we do outreach then to the general public on those items. Or if we're doing an infrastructure project, we would obviously reach out to that neighborhood. But I do think that I would like to see us more engaged in a meaningful way with the general public, because the amount of times I go out to speak to people, even at the university level, and they've never heard of the Met Council, and I don't think that's good. I mean, it means that we're not really doing something right there, because they don't even know who we are. And we do really important work. It's important that they understand that we have like a really good wastewater system. It's very efficient. Our drinking water supply is actually really great. The rivers are clean. And I know that's not just the Met Council, but it's partnerships that have created that. We have some of the best water policy, in the nation here in Minnesota. But what was your question again? It was
how Met Council communicates with private citizens.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of internal conversation right now about looking at our stakeholder lists and thinking, should we not open that up, and what other voices do we need to really bring into this conversation? Because just going back to those same lists every time isn't necessarily going to cut it with a changing environment. Yeah, and how do we engage with local residents in a meaningful way where they feel like they have a stake in what we're doing? I think it's hard sometimes to get the general public interested in the 30-year horizon, though, because they're more interested about what's being built on the street. So, I think that is a challenge, is that people just aren't looking that far out, and I understand that. I'm not sure what the answer is there.
So I think one more question in here. Does Met Council have any interaction with county groups outside Metro, like Region 9, about doing assessments? Region 9 has started to look at adaptation and resiliency using federal consultants, wondering how much cross-organization talk there is in Minnesota.
There is actually there's a fair degree of cross-organization conversation, and that tends to be at our interagency groups. Being a quasi-state agency, we do sit on a lot of boards, and we do work, for instance, we work with the Environmental Quality Board. We also are on the interagency climate adaptation team. So we do actually hear from our agency partners on what's happening. We have a really close relationship with MnDOT and with the other, any of the agencies doing statewide work. We tend to hear of some best practices in other parts of the state. And I think that can really help inform our work. And the nice thing that I'm hearing too now is that some of our greater Minnesota communities are interested in some of our work, which is, I think that's really nice, because I would love it if I could share our localized flooding data with Northfield. They've asked for it, but it just stops north of their border, So, providing them the methodology so they can go ahead and do that work themselves if they like. But I think there's a lot we can learn. I'm certainly open to looking outside the region in terms of best practices for sure.
Great. Well, that brings us to the end of our hour together. Eric, thank you again so much for joining us today. It was a great conversation. It's great to hear from you and a little bit about what that council is doing related to this kind of work. So I'll put in a plug if you do have some time, if the attendees have some time, please fill out that evaluation. We won't be having a December webinar next month. We're going to be taking a break. And then we are having the adaptation conference in January 20th. So that will be online. This group will hear more information about that then. So Eric, thank you very much.
Thank you.